So our next talk is going to be a series of two talks. First, as a heads up, I'm obviously not Kartik. I'm Jacob from the global team too. So I'll be leading the next couple talks from the MC position. And up next, we're going to have two different back-to-back talks. So part one, part two, called the FVM Imaginarium. So it's going to be focused on everything, kind of what's upcoming and what can be built and what can we do and what is already being built. So up first, we're going to have JV and Matt from the Protocol Labs team, who are going to join us and chat about the different requests for startups and different ideas that are kind of out there for things that can be built with the FVM. So welcome both JV and Matt to the stage. Feel free to unmute and share your videos. There we go. Hey, Matt. Hey, JV. And yeah, I'll get out of the way here and let you guys take over.
Awesome. Thanks for that. Let me share my screen. Awesome. Well, thanks for joining us, everybody. I know there's been a lot of amazing talks and there's a couple more to come. But yeah, super excited to have Matt with me here today. I don't know if folks have seen, there's a website that we'll talk about in a second. But as the FVM is launching, there's an amazing amount of opportunities for businesses to be built. We, the Protocol Lab side and the Filecoin Foundation side, have brainstormed a bunch of ideas. This is by no means exhaustive, but would love to share, at least to inspire some builders, on what are different opportunities that exist. And of course, as you're going through this process, if you reach out to the teams, I'm sure there's folks that have individual thoughts that might be able to help advise. So maybe to kick things off, I wanted to start with just a macro frame. I think one thing that's really interesting is just when we zoom out and think about the Filecoin economy, what we have right now, if you think of Filecoin pre-FVM, is sort of this like very basic loop of clients and storage providers that can find each other, they can make deals. The Filecoin blockchain is really settling that. And the thing that the FVM really gives us is now the ability to be much more expressive in what we can do with that economy. So this is just a very basic map showing how much more complicated this economic loop can actually be when we start doing more and more things on chain. But it gives us the ability to build primitives and businesses that may not look like things that you would see elsewhere. So rather than just having a client and storage provider make a deal, if you want to do something that says maybe builds a perpetual storage protocol, which we'll talk about some ideas there, that actually implies a bunch of other services and businesses that might exist on the FVM. And so when we start looking more holistically at like what this economy could look like, it really becomes interesting just in terms of the broad swath of opportunities. So yeah, at the end of this talk, we will also show this link again. There's a much longer list of ideas that people have brainstormed together, really just pulling on the threads of, for the different user groups and communities inside of the Filecoin economy, how might one build businesses around the services for those folks? But we'll talk about a few of them today. So yeah, with my co-MC here, Matt. Maybe Matt, do you want to kick us off? I know you've thought a lot about under-collateralized lending, but I think this is maybe one of the most important things for the storage providers in our economy.
Sure. Yeah, sure thing. Hey, folks. So my name is Matt Hamilton. I'm a developer advocate at Protocol Labs, working on the FVM team. And yeah, as JV said, we've got a number of different use cases here. So the first one I'm going to mention is this idea of under-collateralized lending. Now, if you've come from, say, the Web3 DeFi space, you're probably familiar with the pattern of over-collateralized lending, which is where, for example, you put up some collateral in one token, and you can borrow against it in some other funds. So maybe you put up some Bitcoin or ETH or XRP, and you can borrow something like USDC against that. Now, typically, you have to put up above the value you're lending. So sometimes it's 150% or 200% or whatever it might be in collateral against that. Well, one of the nice things about the Filecoin network is there are real world businesses behind this with data centers and storage and everything. And one of the things you can do is under collateralized lending. And that is because when a storage deal is made on the network, the storage provider has a pretty reasonable income stream, or a reasonably guaranteed income stream over the lifetime of that storage deal. So if I, as a storage provider, agree to store some data for you, then the fee for that storage gets put in effectively an escrow and then gets drip fed to me over the lifetime of that storage deal. Now, I can actually use that future income as collateral for lending. So I can actually put that up and say, hey, well, I'm guaranteed this amount coming forth. So please let me borrow against that future kind of guaranteed income, now in some other token. So that's what kind of under collateralized lending is. And that's, I think, a fairly novel thing that is probably not so possible on many other kind of blockchain economic models, because within, like I said, within Filecoin, you've actually got those income streams coming in. Storage providers have committed for storage.
Yeah, and I think like one interesting, way of looking at this is Filecoin has all of these on-chain businesses. All the storage providers are on-chain businesses. We'll talk about another set in a little bit about like data DAOs as other types of on-chain businesses. But when you have these on-chain businesses that have revenue streams that are getting paid on-chain, we can use sort of like the laws of smart contracts to start writing these more interesting economic primitives that can unlock capital efficiency in the economy. I'll actually touch on maybe another sort of like twist on this, which is once you have these under collateralized lending protocols, a pretty common thing that you might want to do is be able to get like early liquidity. So especially if folks are familiar with sort of like the flow of capital inside of the Filecoin economy, if you are a token holder and you happen to give a storage provider your Filecoin in order to like put it to work, that's going to have a duration over the course of a deal, but maybe you want to be able to like repurpose that collateral in other ways. Liquid staking protocols, ways of tokenizing these assets, can give you early liquidity or can be an opportunity to provide early liquidity, meaning that people can use their capital and that locked collateral in other ways. So if folks have looked at things like Rocket Pool, if folks have looked at things like Eigenlayer, there's interesting elements that might be worth drawing on as we think about how can we use the core Filecoin like collateral like economic loop to start funding and even being used to secure other protocols that could be built on top. And maybe actually to add on top of that, if you're going to build those two things, so under collateralized lending as well as the liquid staking, then it sort of also implies the use case for DEXs and exchanges, places where people can actually take those tokenized assets and then trade them into the other protocol or other tokens that they may be looking for. So I think it's an interesting frame if we really look at these economic models, some of the business models behind them, as well as what is the core infrastructure that maybe just is more the bread and butter of how people think about DeFi today, but combining it with some of the unique opportunities inside of Filecoin. Matt, was there a comment there that you're going to toss in?
No, I was just going to put it in that this, is one of those things that kind of helps expands. There's certain like businesses, and I think we've got a slide later on this, that kind of add in almost like supporting infrastructure for some of the storage systems as well. So even things like a DEX, for example, might not seem, a DEX itself doesn't have anything to do with storage, but it enables a number of other use cases on top of that with regards to storage and the general economic ecosystem around storage as well. So yeah, thanks.
100%. Well, then maybe we can zoom out a little bit. So we talked a little bit about capital flows and some of the use cases and business models that might make sense that help improve the capital efficiency of the Filecoin economy. I think it's also interesting to sort of like bridge that into some of the functional flows, where I think one of the unique opportunities in the Filecoin ecosystem is being able to tie, especially with the FVM, tying programmable capital flows to programmable services. So Matt, do you want to talk a little bit about perpetual storage and what that might look like?
Sure. So with Filecoin, the model is that a client and a storage provider negotiate a storage deal for a certain amount of time and a certain cost. Now, that might be for, say, 100 days or 200 days or whatever it might be there for that storage deal. Now, perpetual storage is the idea that a storage deal could then be continually renewed thereafter. And that might be automated by tools enabled by the FVM, right? So you might be able to incentivize, say, bounty hunters or whatever, to create additional storage deals beyond the length of the initial storage deal to continue this forward. Now, how might this be paid? You might have, for example, people contributing in, and we've probably we might have a slide separately on data DAOs specifically, but you might have people contributing funds in together to fund that perpetual storage, or it might be paid out from some kind of endowment, for example, or some other mechanism by which it could generate, the funds could generate some economic reward that could then be used to fund that. And there's some projects we have in the next talk. I believe we'll have one of the builders is building something based upon this idea, a company called Lighthouse that are doing something along these lines.
Yeah, I think like one of the interesting places where this really intersects is if you're sort of looking at perpetual storage as saying, we have all of these primitives on the Filecoin chain where we can see like, what is the state of like specific deals that have landed on the network? Like what's the health? You can then combine that with sort of incentives to say, I want to make sure there's always a minimum number of X copies, and I can draw down from some static pool of capital, whether that's coming from a data DAO, whether that's coming from other sources, in order to like perpetually make that condition true. And when you start combining that with some of the financial primitives you were talking about before, that's when it gets really exciting, where we can actually use the yield from the Filecoin network to help ongoing perpetually stored data sets, which is pretty exciting. Which sort of goes into data DAOs. So Matt had touched on this briefly. I think there's a number of ways of thinking about what data DAOs could be. I think maybe the simplest form of a data DAO might be something that's very similar to the Internet Archive, where it's just, look, our mission is to preserve this public open data sets. It's really about just making sure that this stays accessible. And effectively what this might look like is a governance structure. Say you have some decision-making on like how this is done. It could be very light. It could also be basically non-existent. It could just be a giant pool of capital, like a pension fund where you're basically aggregating capital that is purely funneling into something like a perpetual storage protocol to make sure that the data that is supposed to be managed is perpetually being funded in perpetuity. You could also think down the line about as things like the compute networks come off the ground, how do you want to handle derivative data sets? How do you want to do things like tokenization so you can have value flows go back? So for permissioning access and then getting some of the retroactive rewards if someone purchases a data set. I think these are things that are interesting to think about. Whereas today we're talking a lot more about the storage side of the house. As more and more features come to the Filecoin economy, these data DAO structures can become increasingly more complex down the line as well. I don't know, Matt, if there was other things you wanted to touch on the data DAO side.
I think you've pretty much covered it. But yeah, one of the things is regarding things like scientific sets or machine learning, for example, that you wouldn't want to do the actual computation of machine learning on-chain on Filecoin. You can do that off-chain. There's a project called Backyao that's part of the Compute Over Data project at Protocol Labs that's working on that. But you could use, again, the Filecoin Virtual Machine to automate some of that and provide some additional governance around that. So you might have an example where one person can create, say, a data DAO in which a raw data set is uploaded. There's a bounty put for somebody to run some computation against that data set. The data set is downloaded by somebody. They do the computation. The end result is uploaded back to Filecoin. They present the deal ID back to the smart contract to say, here, I've done the computation. Here's the deal. And you might even have then a set of, say, witnesses or validators that can then look at that data. They might even be, a human process that analyze the data and say, yes, that task has been completed. They vote on the completion. So that's another sort of DAO-like thing. They can vote on whether or not that task has been suitably completed. And if it is, then the DAO might then pay out. And, maybe you could imagine a scenario where 60% of the funds go out to the computation provider, 30% are split amongst the validators, and 10% goes to the DAO for the maintenance or something along those lines. So there's a lot of different models that can be built from some of these simple primitives. And the demo just now by Zach, the last example he showed, gives you some example of how you could structure a data DAO and how you could incentivize the participants to take care of the storage actions required for the data DAO.
And I guess like maybe one other thing before we move off of this one that might be interesting to think about is the different funding models to bootstrap some of these organizations. It could purely be just donations from individual folks. It could actually also be like soliciting folks, like if they're public open science data sets, are there governments that might be willing to put money into this? Other research institutions where you can get universities to collaboratively, instead of everyone individually stop trying to solve the problem on their own, can we pull together the resources collectively to just deduplicate work? Or it could also be like NFT holders, like can you mint NFTs to fund these public goods, which is another interesting avenue to think about.
Yeah, indeed. And no, just one more bit on that with the funding models. One of the things I've heard a lot about is actually scientific data funding is really quite complex in some scenarios. You might have multiple different funding bodies funding a particular particular scientific effort. So you can imagine something like a data DAO that could almost like pay out in response to the funding that is put in. So different bodies that are investing in that funding in that project and funding that project could then get rewards, you know, in proportion to maybe the way they've funded it. So yeah, on to on-ramp. Shall I take this one as well while I'm here?
Yeah, go for it.
So with the Filecoin network at the moment, and again, you saw just from Zach's demo earlier, he was talking about storing piece IDs, and these are kind of large chunks. Generally, the Filecoin network itself is concerned with storing sort of large, sort of almost like wholesale, if you can imagine, sort of chunks of data, 32 gigs of data. So how does that help when you've got your 50 KB JPEG image for your NFT, for example, you want to store that on Filecoin? Well, there's a number of storage helpers that are coming out. So things like NFT.storage, Web3 storage, Estuary, Lighthouse. There's a number of them that are building out, and they're helping sort of on-ramp data into the Filecoin network. And again, using something like data DAOs could help that process, because you could fund the onboarding of that data collectively via that, and some of the management of that data. So I think that would that's another use case there.
100%. And when you think about things like cultural archives, some of the requirements are very specific, or even like video data if you're optimizing for fast reads. And so some of these may be really interesting opportunities, both as like products or services to be funded through data DAOs to basically on-ramp a bunch of data, but also maybe like individually interesting business models of their own, depending on the requirements on like retrieval and things like that. Cool. Yeah, programmable storage markets, I think, is a really fascinating one. So Filecoin itself is like a quite flexible protocol. And so the markets actors as they are today are just one implementation. I think there's opportunities to think about what are different ways that someone might want to build these markets themselves. This gets a little bit more into the weeds of like, if people haven't driven into the guts of Filecoin itself. But I think it becomes interesting of where there are opportunities to build better markets, and also maybe think about different ways of even setting up deals, how to sort of like think about sort of like the incentive models when people set up bounties and things like that, just for sort of like settling the actual transactions that might be like being struck off chain. And so, yeah, I think there's opportunities here just to think more about what are potential opportunities that, yeah, might exist. I don't know, Matt, if you have any on this one.
Yeah, I think that's a key point, and it's an opportunity here to point out a little bit about how Filecoin works, and to sort of clarify that a lot of the process that happens around the Filecoin, the entire kind of storage protocol, happens off-chain. The idea being is that it's a very flexible system, and that the actual negotiation of the storage deal between the client and the storage provider is effectively left, you know, flexible. It is not like mandated kind of on-chain a particular way, but is done off-chain. Because you can imagine, if I'm trying to store a vast amount of data, then again, it might be a case of, you know, a station wagon full of hard drives going down the highway is the easiest way for me to get my data to the storage provider to store it. So a lot of the you know, the negotiation of the storage deal happens offline at the moment. And happens separately by the Filecoin protocol, but not actually on the blockchain. Whereas now what we have is the ability through FVM and through the smart contracts to now build some of these automated marketplaces. So I could actually like bid for storage based upon a certain price, or somebody could actually you know, offer prices or whatever. You could have this kind of you know, a bit like a limit order book type thing, perhaps around storage or whatever you might want there. So that adds a lot of flexibility on top of the network to automate some of those processes.
Or, I mean, another way of looking at it is like with additional features. So like, as people do things like on-chain credentialing for storage providers, perhaps you would say like, I would like to set a bounty for storing data, but I only would like storage providers that are in specific geographies to be able to like bid on this data. Or maybe you'd like to say like, I would like a max retrieval price, and then have a retrievability oracle or something where a storage provider is locking up collateral to like guarantee that they will actually serve the requirements. You basically can extend and define broader ways of setting up these storage deals with more primitives inside. which gets to retrievability oracles, which I think is a really fascinating like service that could be built into the network. If folks haven't seen, there's a great video that Nicola from the CryptoNet Lab, he sort of put out a couple months ago. But this is the idea that you could have an on-chain entity that sort of acts as like a better business bureau for storage providers. So imagine me and Matt are making a deal. I am a client, Matt is a storage provider, and I want to guarantee that Matt will never try to like price gouge me on retrieval. And at the time when he strikes the deal, he might say, John, I will never charge you more than 5 cents a gigabyte to retrieve your data. And that's totally true, but then some exogenous shock happens and Matt's like, actually, it's going to cost you 50. Well, with the retrievability oracle, the way this might work is you could have a DAO where when Matt and I make this initial deal, we both send in the terms to this deal to the retrievability oracle, and they say, okay, we will make sure that this is always enforced over the lifetime of the deal. And Matt, you're going to lock up a bunch of collateral so that we know that if you ever try to violate that, there's something to be done. And so now Matt and I can do our transactions. If something goes wrong, I can always appeal to the retrievability oracle. They can try to get the data from Matt against the terms that we had set. If they can't do it, they'll flash Matt. If they can do it, they just send me the data. So this is just like another functional, like, here's a service that can be built on the network that provides a level of security for clients that could totally be wrapped into a broader set of storage primitives. Okay, that was a lot of content. This is only even scratching the surface of like what could be built on the FVM. I'd encourage everyone, if you have your phone, scan this QR code, go to this URL. If you're looking for more ideas, feel free to reach out to anyone on the team. I think we are super excited about what this unlocks for the FVM and excited for y'all to take the ball and run. So yeah, thanks everybody.
Thanks a lot. And let's see what you build.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Matt, JV. I guess for everybody who's watching, if you're part of the hackathon, I mean, this is like one of those talks that is absolutely pure alpha for you. You're going to definitely be building over the next couple weeks. And I think Matt and JV just kind of went through the gamut of what's possible and some different ideas.